Today we're going to talk about philosophical and practical origins of the Constitution. Last class we did everything leading up to the Constitution. Let's go into the reading review here. I want to frame the Federalist Paper before I ask if you guys have any questions. The purpose of the Federalist Papers was to convince the public and influential members of American society that the Constitution is a good idea. Remember, they're wary at this point of government overreach and tyranny, and so they decide that, well, the framers decide that they need to get public opinion on their side. They also, the Federalist Papers, give us insight into why the United States needed a stronger union at the time, kind of bolstering everything we covered in the lecture last week, and how the structure of the new government was designed to solve these existing deep problems in democratic politics at large, not just in America. What does Federalist number 1 say? Can someone give me like a sentence-long elevator pitch, 2-sentence-long elevator pitch? It can be rambly, that's fine. 3 key takeaways from each of these. Hamilton argues that this new union is essential for national survival. He frames the current situation as America at a crossroads. The Articles of Confederation have failed them, and now the balance of the nation is potentially going to just topple over. The Americas, or the United States of America, as we conceive it, might cease to exist. Second, he makes this argument that the debate over the Constitution and over the future of America should rise above self-interest. Here he's kind of, playing some rhetorical tricks with his critics by basically saying, now, I've heard that there are a lot of people who are concerned with this new form of government, but I think that their concerns are often rather petty and too focused on what this means for them rather than what it means for the public good. And people should be concerned with what this means for the public good more than the individual. Keep in mind how this contrasts with how I framed the formation of the United States in the last lecture. And finally, he basically says, guys, you don't need to worry about a strong government. Strong government doesn't destroy liberty. Rather, it provides the opportunity to protect it. Here he's pushing back against the idea that a stronger national government automatically leads to tyranny. He argues that without vigor, or as he frames it, an energetic government, that word energy is important, government can't protect people's rights or provide security. What is Hamilton then saying in Federalist number 9? Hamilton argues that Confederacy prevents faction and unrest, and he does this by viewing historical examples of democracies going back to ancient Greece and Italy in particular. And he argues that a well-designed confederacy can reduce domestic conflict and rebellion, like our gentleman over there said. In a union, states can help check each other as well as the federal government. If one state falls to unrest or corruption, then another state can step in, or a group of other states, and help prevent that from spreading throughout the entire nation. He also argues that modern checks improve republics. He says, if we look back to ancient times with these democracies, they weren't really operating with all of the philosophical tools that we have now. We can read Locke, we can read Montesquieu, we can read Hobbes, and we can talk about these ideas in a much more cogent way than our forefathers could. All of these new ideas, the separation of power, checks and balances in this kind of new version of federalism, can help safeguard against these past failures. And finally, he says a large union balances state autonomy. Here what he's saying is that the critique that a republic has to be small to survive is not actually true. And he's citing Montesquieu here. In the new system, states would keep certain powers rather than the federal government, but the federal government would have enough power to coordinate peace and defense, and then in turn promote stability. That brings us to my personal favorite Federalist paper, and what I would argue is the most prescient and forward-looking Federalist paper out of the entire bunch. If you have to remember one of them, hint, hint, this is the one I'm going to be asking about on the exam, it should be Federalist number 10. What is James Madison saying in Federalist number 10? That's exactly right. Can we define what he means by faction? Yeah. And today, when we think about groups of individuals that have different thoughts about things in a political context, what does that sound like? Parties. He's talking about political parties. So, faction is inevitable in a free society. It's going to happen. You can't avoid it. However, you can work through the government to help funnel the different passions and opinions into something that is productive. It's not whether or not you can eliminate factions, but rather how you successfully manage them. He argues, supporting Hamilton's earlier point, that large republics actually dilute factional power. I would argue this isn't so true anymore now that we have the internet to connect people over large distances, but at the time his idea is people are so different, spread out over such a large space, that to create these solid majorities that can dominate the minority, it's very difficult in a large space. And finally, this last point is that the Constitution, as they structure it, produces representation through a Republican form of government, small r, as in we send representatives to represent our ideas, not just like the Athenian direct democracy. Together, these documents and the Federalist Papers as a whole are kind of wrestling with this core question of how you design a government that is big enough and strong enough to protect the liberty of its citizens, but not so centralized that the tyranny produced from large government then destroys that liberty. We get more into that in the lecture today. We're going to hop on over to the Constitution corner here. I assigned Articles 1, 2, and 3, Sections 1, 2, or 1, 1, and 1 from each of those. Can someone tell me what Article 1, Section 1 says? Yeah, Article 1, Section 1. Legislative power is vested in Congress, right? First article, there's a bit more information in there about establishing it as a bicameral legislature, etc., but that's not important for the gist of it. I just flashed you Article 2, Section 1 right there, but can someone tell me what Article 2, Section 1 says? The executive power is vested in the president. It establishes the president as the head of the executive branch, charged with enforcing the national law. So, in their mind, the legislature creates law, the executive branch enforces it. What is Article 3, Section 1? Judicial power is vested in the Supreme Court. Hot dog, look at that. These three provisions here establish the basic tripartite structure of government in America. You have the three branches, and they are vested in those specific bodies. Philosophical and practical origins of the U.S. Constitution. A review of what we covered last class. There were some practical triggers to what led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. First, the massive debt and weak credit associated with the Revolutionary War. Remember, we ran up these massive debts to soldiers in the Americas, as well as to our allies abroad, mainly France, that we owed, but at the same time, we had very weak credit being a new nation, therefore we couldn't borrow to actually pay off the money we borrowed before. In addition to this, the economic situation is made even worse through trade wars and currency chaos. When I say trade wars, I'm talking about these interstate tariff wars. Remember, I used the example of New York taxing lumber from New Jersey coming into the New York harbor. And with currency, each state is printing their own paper money that is essentially worthless. It confuses trade between states. Are you using Rhode Island currency? Are you using Pennsylvania currency? Are you using Georgia currency? And also causing massive inflation. Additionally, there's unrest in the American frontier. The example of Shays' Rebellion in rural Massachusetts kind of typifies the general unrest that a lot of veterans from the Revolutionary War are feeling because they are not being paid their due pensions. And finally, all of this pushes these chaotic events, this terrible situation, into a practical necessity for a more energetic central government rather than just kind of a preference for one that you might think about when you think of the framers, right? If they're looking at the menu of all of their possible forms of government they could adopt, I think the common narrative is, oh, we chose this one because it's the best one. Rather, the situation necessitated them having this kind of government because things were so bad at the time. So they start looking for solutions. And where they look is through these philosophical foundations. Now, we already hinted a little bit at Locke when we talked about the Declaration of Independence, but they get this idea of certain inalienable rights and inherent rights and privileges of citizens from John Locke, as well as the social contract, right? We enter into a contract with the government that we give up some of our freedom to them, and in return we receive security and protection from the state, and later on we can extrapolate that to being certain services like healthcare and the like. They also get this modern notion of separated powers from Montesquieu. You'll get into this in the video a little bit more that is due on Thursday, but Montesquieu conceptualizes the separation of powers in this new kind of way where you have these distinct branches of government that all have distinct roles, rather than just codifying the roles that government should have, which prior philosophers had already done. We also have this notion of republicanism that they like. There's this notion of civic virtue and this idea that we can really play with regime type to find what fits us. When I say republicanism, I'm not talking about the Republican Party. I am, as I was talking about before, talking about a form of government in which we have representatives represent our interest in a governing body, rather than a direct democracy. In America, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. And finally, they pull from English common law traditions and colonial charters. When I talk about English common law traditions, I'm referencing the Magna Carta, like I talked about last class, but also the entire tradition of English common law since then. This notion that laws are fluid and interpretable to be most applicable to the time in which we're facing them. The alternative to a common law system, and this isn't super important, but I'm merely adding it as context, is a code law system. Nations like Germany have a code law system. That is where you have all of your laws stipulated and listed out, and those are not up for interpretation. If you want to change them, you actually have to change them. Here, we have courts interpret our laws for us. And then colonial charters is fairly self-explanatory. They're already being governed under these charters, and so they adopt some of the principles of these charters into how they envision government for America. This leads to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And this is really a crossroads moment. The delegates arrive in Philadelphia with the notion that they're going to revise the Articles of Confederation, but quickly realize that they are too broken to fix and they need to start over. So they quickly adopt these oaths of secrecy, and they can't talk with anyone about what's going on in the Constitutional Convention for fear of it coming out that they're basically restarting the country. They're resetting it. There's a central debate that starts, that continues throughout the entirety of the constitutional ratification process, between how big they want this national government to be and how much power they want vested in the state. Sure, the Declaration lists all of these lofty ideals about individual citizens, but the framers are beyond the idea of envisioning individual citizen rights just now. When they're thinking of creating this founding document, they need to balance the actual governing entities of the country, those being the nation, the federal government, and individual state power, which many want to still be preeminent, as it was in the Articles of Confederation. Part of this, too, they're debating how far they want democracy to be extended. Some are pushing for more direct democracy, and there are a lot of them, though, that are elitists, and they think that the average American citizen is not too bright and should therefore leave it to the experts, basically, to govern the country. And through all of this, you have these nation-state divides in terms of where power rests. You also have a key debate about representation. How is representation going to happen in this new government? And one of the key fault lines for that is, of course, slavery. So this question about representation, particularly in the legislature, as they conceive it the most expansive branch because it's the one creating the laws, comes to a crossroads in this thing called the Great Compromise. So Virginia, being the most populous state at the time, comes forward and says, okay, in this new government, I think every state should be represented proportionately from population. It's very self-serving. They're the ones who have all the people, so they're going to have the most power and can dominate. Smaller states don't like that. In particular, New Jersey. New Jersey comes forward and says, that's very unfair and unreasonable what you're saying and very self-serving. So what we think should happen is every state should have equal representation as it was under the Articles of Confederation. Sure, we can maybe add a few more people and not make it unanimous voting like it was under the Articles, but still, we need to preserve the power of small states so you don't have, Virginia or New York just steamrolling a state like Delaware. So Connecticut comes in with the Connecticut plan, and they decide we're going to have a bicameral legislature. Can anyone tell me what bicameralism is? What our friend in the back there was talking about is that there are two chambers. He framed them as an upper level and a lower level. That comes from the English tradition, again, where you have the House of Lords and the House of Commons. They frame it as a house that is representative of the people, the population-based house, the House of Representatives, that is your lower house, and a house that represents the state, the upper level, that is the Senate. And at the time, before a later amendment, the senators were not elected directly by the public, but rather chosen by state legislatures. And so essentially you have the Senate is equal population, you have 100 senators, and the House is by population. Again, this is all an argument of representation. And so we reach what is called the Great Compromise and slavery's constitutional architecture. So you have this issue where now you have a house that is based on apportionment of population. And southern states say, oh goody, we have a lot of people who cannot vote and are not citizens, but we're still going to count in our population here, so then we get more representation. Northern states say, hold on, that's really unfair. This isn't a moralistic question for them. Remember, this is just in terms of politics. They say, if you don't count these people as citizens, then you shouldn't count them towards your representation here. Therefore, I don't think that slaves should count as people at all when we're determining representation. And they come up with this idea that a slave is worth 3/5 of a white person when it comes to counting population. This is how they compromise on it. So for every 5 slaves, that counts as 3 people. There are some compromises that happen in here too to appease the northern states and even the very few, and I want to note, very few abolitionists that were among them. For one, by 1808, the international slave trade will be abolished. Now, this sounds like a good thing. In fact, it had a lot of unintended consequences. The southern states, seeing their inflow of free labor being cut off by 1808, and given enough lead time, changed their economies into essentially, and I'm sorry for the reductive language, but this is how they frame it, breeding economies in which they viewed slaves like livestock and produced them at home rather than abroad, producing truly the most atrocious period in American history, and moving forward until the Civil War. In addition, they compromised on the fugitive slave clause that was enslaved people would be returned to the southern states from which they had escaped, and northern states had to cooperate with this. And finally, southern states pushed for no export taxes on certain goods. These southern states were wealthy in products like cotton, indigo, and rice, products that were desirable worldwide and experienced a lot of demand. Therefore, not taxing these export goods or putting very little taxes on them would bolster southern economies. Lighting up a little bit here, the constitutional structure is pretty simple. Again, it's a remarkably short document. The core of the Constitution has 7 articles. The first 3 are the branches of government. Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is the President, and Article 3, the shortest of the 3, is the judiciary. The rest outline specific powers, the federal government, how to amend the Constitution, and how to ratify it. And it is a very, very brief document. I cannot emphasize enough how brief it is compared to a lot of modern constitutions as we understand them now, or for instance, its forebear in the British Constitution, which is made up of thousands and thousands of documents of historic common law code. First, we have the legislative branch. As we noted, Congress is a dual structure. The upper house is the Senate, made to represent the interests of the states. That is there are 2 senators for every state. Now there are 100, obviously, because there are 50 states. And the House is done by population. Can anyone tell me how many members of the House of Representatives there are? 435. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives. When we get to the Congress week, we'll go into all of this in much more detail. It's my favorite week. I'm a Congress scholar. They also list their enumerated powers. Does anyone know what some of the specific powers that Congress has are? They also have the power to declare war, even though the president is commander-in-chief, and they have the power to tax and spend. That is the power of the purse. When people talk about the power of the purse, that's what they mean. They also have this thing called the necessary and proper clause, which basically says that they can do anything necessary and proper to carry out the duties of their office, to legislate. It's a very elastic clause that allows the institution to evolve over time and allows them to do things that aren't specifically enumerated in the Constitution. And as I said, this creates an elastic authority for them, and it can adapt over time. Then we have the executive branch. I'm not going to ask you who this guy is. Everybody knows who that guy is. So they decide we need an independent and energetic president, someone who can get out there and do things. This is a large departure from the Articles of Confederation that did not have an executive authority simply because they feared tyranny of monarchs too much. The president's key roles include being commander-in-chief. He is the head of the armed forces. Congress still reserves the right to declare war, but in the modern era, we don't declare war anymore. We just have military actions. He is also the chief executive and diplomat. In a lot of countries, you will have a head of state and a head of government. Let's use Britain as an example again. The king is the head of state. He is the one who is technically the face of the nation on the world stage. He does diplomacy and, in writing at least, is supposed to handle the big things, right? What Britain is. In practice, the king doesn't have any power anymore, really. And then the head of government, that is domestic affairs, everyday legislation, falls to the prime minister. In America, we don't have that. That's too complicated for us. We put the head of state and the head of government in one person. That's the president. The president also has the power to nominate officials and judges. Remember, the executive branch isn't just the president. He has an entire bureaucracy underneath him. And the ability to appoint judges as well gives him some oversight over the judicial branch as well. Speaking of, we have the judicial branch. So the judicial branch is established through the Supreme Court. Inferior courts are kind of muddy. They don't really care too much about them. Lower courts are, as I said, optional. To differentiate the Supreme Court and the courts from the executive and the judiciary, they make lifetime tenure for judges. That means that they are not, in theory, subject to the political whims of parties and factions and don't have to face re-election through a constituency. They can rather impartially judge the law. There's a video, the 6th video, I just finished it, so it should be posted by tomorrow, talking about Supreme Court legitimacy that goes into this a little bit more. There is no explicit judicial review in the Constitution. Does anybody know what judicial review is? Okay, that's not surprising, it's fine. Judicial review is the ability for the Supreme Court to decide whether or not a law is unconstitutional. So basically the whole thing the Supreme Court does. That doesn't exist in the Constitution, and it doesn't exist for many years afterward. Well, a few years afterwards. There's a case, Marbury v. Madison, that happens that we'll go into when we get to the Supreme Court unit or week of class. But basically, the Supreme Court is originally just another court. They can't just cast down laws that they don't like. There's this idea of the full faith and credit clause. Essentially, if you are a citizen of the state of Georgia and you go to the state of South Carolina, you should be given the same rights and privileges as a resident of the state of South Carolina would. Basically, if we think about it as the states as different nation states or different countries, you would have essentially dual citizenship in both. The laws of one impact you just as if you were a citizen of that state. Part of that, too, is the Privileges and Immunities Clause. It essentially prevents states from discriminating against citizens from other states. You can't be the South Carolina state government and say, you from Georgia, you're not allowed here, you can't go here, you can't do that. And then you have the Supremacy Clause, which essentially states that the federal law, the law of the united government, is the supreme law of the land. Sure, states have laws, states have rights, but if there is a contradiction, the federal law is supreme. So you have two main factions that are arguing over the Constitution here. Already, Madison's fears are realized. You have two parties. You have the Federalists. Federalists are largely composed of members of port cities, right? And commercial corridors, that's Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and even Charleston. This isn't a standard north-south debate like we frame a lot of issues in American politics here. And they want uniform trade laws and a strong credit and national enforcement so that if they, as merchants and capitalists, are engaging with each other, they're all playing the same game based on the same rules. Then you have the Anti-Federalists, and these come from frontier counties. That's like western Massachusetts, upstate New York, the interior Virginia, and even the Piedmont of the Carolinas. And this is dominated by small landholders and debtors who are wary of these coastal elites, right? Where for the Federalists, you have people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. The latter three are the authors of the Federalist Papers under the pseudonym Publius. You have individuals like Patrick Henry and George Mason and Mercy Otis Warren, who write under these pseudonyms Brutus, Cato, and the Federal Farmer, and actually write the Anti-Federalist Papers in opposition. And here they're fearing the eventual creep of tyranny of this new energetic national government. They fear a standing army that could be employed against its own citizens. And they essentially say, we're not going to sign on to this unless there are specific enumerated rights for individuals listed within the Constitution. Which brings us to ratification. How did this actually happen? Only 9 out of the 13 states are required to ratify the Constitution. And rather than having state legislatures ratify them, they require smaller conventions to do it. And they do this because they think maybe this will stop factionalism and infighting and gridlock and try to push this through. And while they only require 9 of the 13, they do want unanimous support for this new constitution because that shows that they are actually unified under this new government, and maybe it might last a little longer. As I said, the Federalists are arguing for the large republic, an energetic government that is strong, and the Anti-Federalists are like, hey guys, maybe let's go back to the Articles of Confederation and give those another try, maybe with some updated bits to it. And the thing that clinches it is the Bill of Rights. Remember how the Anti-Federalists said, we're not going to do this unless there's a list of enumerated rights? Well, they got what they wanted. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, are what actually allows the Constitution to pass. There are constitutional limits, and as I see it, there are 3.5 constitutional limits that are baked into power. The first is the separation of powers. I talk about that a lot in the video this week. I'm going to gloss over it for right now. There's also checks and balances. That's the lecture on Thursday, so I'm going to gloss over it a little bit here too. Then there's federalism. I also talk about that in the video, but the idea is basically states can check the federal government and vice versa. And finally, there's the Bill of Rights for individual citizens. That's the half one. Finally, we have amendments and rights. So the Bill of Rights, as I established, repetition is important here, was the deal for ratifying the Constitution. There are limits on federal power in the Bill of Rights, not just for the individual, but for the state, and it enumerates key freedoms. What are some of the freedoms under the Bill of Rights? There are also 17 later changes that modify the Constitution. There are 27 amendments in total. By the end of this class, you will ideally have all of them memorized. That do a lot of great things. They expand the franchise. Does anyone know what I mean when I say the franchise? Your right to vote, right? So people talk about disenfranchisement or enfranchisement. The franchise is the right to vote. There are amendments that allow black men the right to vote, and then later all women the right to vote. There are amendments that change process, clarify the succession to the presidency, and essentially change is really hard by design. Can anyone tell me when the 27th Amendment passed? Good old 1992. This is the actual footage from the day that they voted on it, or ratified it. Technically, Michigan was the last to ratify it, but that's neither here nor there. It is incredibly hard to change the Constitution.